Stop. Don't scroll any further. What you're about to learn will shatter your illusions about Hollywood's golden age. These idols smiled down from posters, sang about love, and seemed like gods on earth, but behind the scenes, they were building mansions that looked more like torture chambers or deranged stage sets. The whole country worshipped them while they padded their walls with pink fur for secret orgies, hid behind 9-foot fences from reality, and cut corners so sharply they built houses out of rotting timber. And the last story will truly blow your mind. One great diva lived in a 16th-century villa that had once hosted kings, only to end her days surrounded by court officers and seized property. For years, she staged the illusion of luxury while her real home decayed from within, and today, not even its foundation remains. Stay until the end to learn whose walls absorbed so many lies they had to be leveled to the ground. The truth will shock you. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which star was the most unhinged builder of them all. Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino was Hollywood's first true sex symbol, a man whose single glance could make women faint and men nervously straighten their ties. But behind the facade of the Latin lover stood a man riddled with insecurities and possessed by an almost manic devotion to theatricality, which he poured into his estate, Falcon Lair. In 1925, at the height of his fame and fortune, Valentino decided he needed a residence worthy of his status as a living god. He paid an astronomical $175,000 for a parcel of land in Beverly Hills and erected a house meant to serve as his personal fortress. The name Falcon Lair sounded grand, but in truth, the mansion became a monument to the actor's loneliness and peculiar tastes. His obsession with security turned Falcon Lair into a prison. Terrified of his fans, women who were said to be ready to tear him to pieces for a button from his jacket, Rudy erected a 9-foot concrete wall around the property. It was the first structure of its kind in Beverly Hills, and neighbors whispered that he must be hiding either orgies or shameful secrets behind it. In reality, there was nothing inside but the cold gleam of gilt surfaces and Valentino himself wandering through empty halls in embroidered robes, rehearsing his roles before towering mirrors. He believed in mysticism and curses, and the house was steeped in his superstitions. When he died suddenly in 1926, Hollywood trembled, but the true strangeness of Falcon Lair was only beginning. The master's death did not calm the house. If anything, it seemed to awaken it, drawing swindlers and ghost hunters like moths to a flame. After the great lover's passing, the estate changed hands several times, yet no owner managed to remain there long. Actor Harry Carey moved in hoping for peace and found himself in what would now be called a low-budget horror film. At night, eerie wails echoed through the corridors, and strange clicking sounds pulsed inside the walls, as though something unseen were counting down to disaster. Carey complained that bats had taken up residence in hidden chambers and ventilation shafts, swooping out at dusk in flocks that made the house feel genuinely cursed. But the most humiliating revelation was still to come. One of the caretakers, eager to profit from grieving fans, had installed a makeshift technical laboratory in the basement. This enterprising spiritualist strung wires through the house and fitted blinking bulbs behind panels to simulate the apparition of Valentino's spirit during paid seances. Gullible ladies in mourning handed over their last dollars to witness the glowing silhouette of the sheik in the dark, never realizing it was nothing more than cheap stagecraft and a few cleverly placed relays. The story of Falcon Lair is the story of Hollywood ambition collapsing under the weight of reality. A house built as a symbol of eternal passion and aristocratic grandeur ended as a sideshow for amateur mediums and a refuge for bats. Valentino tried to dazzle the world, constructing elaborate scenery for a life he never truly had, a life that was quiet, majestic, and secure. In the end, his supposed sanctuary became an object of ridicule and lawsuits. In 2006, bulldozers finally leveled Falcon Lair, erasing the last traces of Rudolph's presence within its walls. Behind the 9-foot barrier there had been no magic at all, only emptiness and a couple of broken relays in the basement. Today, nothing remains to recall the great lover except an old stable that somehow survived, standing as a mute witness to how swiftly Hollywood demolishes its own monuments once belief in them fades.
Jayne Mansfield. If you think modern kitsch and the so-called Barbiecore obsession with glamour were invented yesterday, then you have simply never seen the pink palace of Jayne Mansfield. The studios marketed her as the smart blonde, boasting an IQ supposedly higher than Einstein's, yet when it came to interior design, she seemed guided by the logic of a 5-year-old let loose in an endless warehouse of cotton candy. After purchasing a sprawling 40-room mansion on the legendary Sunset Boulevard, Jayne decided the world should tremble before her individuality. She transformed the historic building into something that would make any sane architect's eyes bleed. Nearly everything in the house, from the facade to the last soap dish, was painted a violent electric pink. Mansfield did not merely love the color, she was possessed by it, dragging a team of painters behind her to repaint the walls again and again until they practically glowed in the dark like a radioactive dessert. She claimed the house had to be an extension of her screen persona, but in truth, she built a life-sized stage set in which common sense had no speaking part. The heart of this delirium was Jayne's bedroom, which looked less like a place to sleep and more like the inside of a giant teddy bear. Walls, ceiling, even the furniture were swathed in pink fur from floor to cornice. Imagine stifling Los Angeles heat pressing against the windows while you stand inside a room lined with dusty pink pile that absorbed perfume, hairspray, and the quiet terror of her many guests. Jayne herself felt perfectly at home in this furry inferno, posing for photographers in negligées that blended seamlessly into the walls. The crowning triumph of her kitsch genius was the infamous heart-shaped swimming pool. Her husband, Mickey Hargitay, former Mr. Universe, personally helped construct this hydraulic miscalculation. Across the bottom, in large gold letters, shimmered a monumental declaration, "I love you, Jayne." To this day, Hollywood Hills folklore insists that during the wildest parties, pink champagne flowed from the palace fountains, though skeptics maintain it was nothing more than dyed water. To cement her reputation as the most eccentric diva in town, Mansfield even kept a pet tiger on the grounds, the animal prowling across pink-tinted lawns and startling couriers and unsuspecting passers-by. Poor Mickey was not merely a husband, he was an unpaid foreman in this marshmallow ghetto. One can only imagine what ran through his mind as he woke each morning in a room resembling a candy box and went out to clean a pool that literally proclaimed his wife's love in gold script. Life in the Pink Palace was a perpetual photo shoot. Jayne summoned reporters for the slightest pretext, proudly displaying heart-shaped pink bathtubs and boasting that even her toilet paper matched the theme. She genuinely believed she was creating history, forging a legend that would outlive the centuries. She paraded her children and pets through this pink delirium, never noticing how her reality was slipping into cheap farce. Neighbors, many of them serious and discreet people, openly despised the architectural perversion, but Mansfield did not care. She basked in the glow of her pink fame, convinced that luxury meant everything around you glittered and shimmered like costume jewelry. The story of this rosy nightmare ended as tragically and absurdly as Jayne herself ended her life. After her death in a car crash, the house struggled to find a buyer reckless enough to leave its interiors intact. Eventually, in 2002, the Pink Palace was reduced to rubble by bulldozers, an act of genuine mercy toward the Californian landscape. The building, meant to stand as a monument to eternal beauty and love, became a heap of pink debris. Nothing of its former splendor remained. No fur-lined walls, no golden confession at the bottom of the pool, no trace of that blonde spirit who tried to turn life into an endless cartoon. It was a perfect example of how Hollywood's hunger for attention can give birth to a monster of concrete and pink paint that ultimately devours itself, leaving behind only dust and the faint scent of old perfume.
Charlie Chaplin.
Our great tramp, Charlie Chaplin, was a genius on screen, but in life he had a reputation for driving accountants to hysteria with his pathological thrift. When he decided in 1922 to build himself a mansion in Beverly Hills, everyone expected a palace worthy of the richest and most influential comedian on the planet. But Chaplin would not have been Chaplin if he hadn't tried to squeeze the last drop of value out of every cent, turning the construction process into a comedy of the absurd. Instead of hiring a professional architectural firm and qualified builders, Charlie concluded that his own studio employees would do just as well. He quite literally dragged carpenters, decorators, and stagehands from the film set up to his hilltop, ordering them to construct a residence in between assembling scenery for his movies. The trouble was that these men were used to working with plywood, papier-mâché, and thin slats designed to last only until the director called cut. None of them had the faintest idea about foundations, load-bearing walls, or the long-term durability of materials, and Chaplin was perfectly content with that, so long as the price remained low. The result was an architectural misunderstanding that Hollywood society promptly christened the breakaway house. It was a true cardboard castle, erected according to the laws of stagecraft. The walls were so thin that a whisper in one room carried clearly to the far end of the building, and the plaster began to crack and crumble before the owner had even moved in his furniture. Chaplin seemed to be living in a film that refused to end. He entertained distinguished guests while pretending that the leaking roof and shifting floors were minor inconveniences, unworthy of a great artist's concern. His habit of economizing on nails and quality timber ensured that the mansion required endless cosmetic repairs. Rather than investing once in solid concrete, Charlie preferred to patch holes and re-glue peeling wallpaper as though he were trapped inside a set from the gold rush. It became a monument to Hollywood miserliness, where behind an imposing facade lurked a fragile structure ready to surrender to a strong gust of wind. Life inside such a house was a constant trial for the nerves of its inhabitants. Chaplin's wives, one after another, complained of the absence of basic comfort and the nagging sense that they were living in a cardboard box. Charlie led his chosen companions through this domestic ordeal, insisting that austerity was a mark of high art, when in truth it was a symptom of chronic greed. He could spend millions reshooting a single scene, yet choke over an extra $1 for plumbing repairs in his own home. Guests often recalled the peculiar unreality of visiting Chaplin. Everything felt false, temporary, and unreliable. In a strange way, it was the highest form of meta-art. The man who built his career on the image of a penniless vagabond had, in reality, constructed a house that differed little in quality from his character's shack. The only distinction was that this shack stood on prestigious hills and cost thousands in taxes. The story of the breakaway house ended predictably. It did not survive its creator in its original form. After Chaplin left the United States amid political persecution, the mansion was repeatedly rebuilt because living in a cardboard castle without constant studio maintenance was simply unsafe. Chaplin left behind not only great films, but also a curious lesson in what happens when cinematic illusion attempts to overrule the laws of physics. He was a genius who believed he could outwit even time with sticks and scraps. Yet in the end his house remained only in the memories of contemporaries, a symbol of the old truth that the miser pays twice, and the great miser pays with the eternal exasperation of his carpenters. Today not a trace remains of that original theatrical grandeur, and only faded newsreels remind us how Charlie Chaplin tried to turn his private life into an endless comedy of errors, risking burial beneath the rubble of his own ambitions.
Mary Pickford.
Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were the first true monarchs of Hollywood, a couple whose authority in the industry was so immense that their Beverly Hills estate, Pickfair, was officially nicknamed the Second White House. It was not merely a residence, but a state within a state, sprawling across 15 acres where, at the dinner table, one might find Albert Einstein seated beside Lord Mountbatten and the Duke of Windsor. Mary, America's sweetheart, and Douglas, the silver screen's greatest swashbuckler, fashioned a monument to prestige, filling their estate with everything money and status could secure in the roaring 1920s. Yet behind immaculate facades, manicured lawns, and gold-rimmed china lingered an atmosphere that could hardly be called warm. The mansion, born from a modest hunting lodge and expanded into a palace, became a place where reality tangled with something unspoken and unsettling. From the beginning, Douglas and Mary complained of strange sensations. Drafts slipped through the corridors of Pickfair with no open windows to blame. Servants whispered of a tall woman in white who drifted soundlessly down the staircases before dawn. Pickford herself, despite her iron will, confessed to close friends that the house sometimes felt like a living organism, watching its owners with silent reproach. The tragedy of Pickfair was that it stood upon a foundation of towering ambition and fractured hearts. When the royal marriage collapsed, Mary remained alone in the mansion, retreating into seclusion and drowning her solitude in alcohol as vast rooms gathered dust and cobwebs. The house seemed to wither alongside its mistress, growing darker, more secretive. After Pickford's death in 1979, the estate struggled to find a worthy new owner until, in the 1980s, singer Pia Zadora purchased it with her millionaire husband. The new proprietors intended to restore Pickfair to its former glory, but they encountered resistance no amount of money could overcome. Zadora's daughter began to complain of a tall white woman standing over her bed in the nursery, erupting in a chilling, blood-freezing laugh. It was not merely a child's fantasy. Pia herself, along with members of the staff, reported persistent disturbances, doors opening of their own accord, rooms turning abruptly icy, heavy tapestries stirring in perfect silence. The mansion seemed determined to expel the intruders who had dared to disturb the peace of its spectral inhabitants. Zadora's decision stunned the nation and outraged architectural historians. Instead of calling in exorcists or continuing the restoration, she summoned bulldozers. In 1990, the legendary Pickfair was razed to its foundations. Zadora coolly told the press that the house was hopelessly infested with termites and ghosts, and that living there was physically impossible. Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., eyes brimming with tears, lamented the destruction of a monument to an entire era. But Pia remained resolute. No historic designation was worth enduring the nightly laughter of a dead queen of Hollywood. Thus ended the most famous home in America, claimed either by genuine phantoms of the past or by the fierce imagination of a new owner unwilling to share her bedrooms with the shadows of Mary and Douglas. A new mansion rose in its place, yet some say that even upon the fresh foundation, people still feel a strange unease, as if the soil of Beverly Hills remembers the days when ghostly laughter ruled and Pickfair stood at the center of the universe. Today, all that remains of Pickfair are its monogrammed gates and a handful of photographs in which Mary Pickford smiles coyly before her domain. It stands as a perfect example of how a Hollywood house can become a curse, evolving from a cozy nest into a mausoleum for ambition. Mary and Douglas brought the world to its doors to prove their greatness, yet in the end, they created a place that welcomed no one but their own ghosts. The story of Pickfair reminds us that Hollywood legends do not simply fade away. They linger in the walls of their palaces until those walls collapse beneath a bulldozer's blade, clearing the ground for new, equally strange tales of triumph and ruin.
Marion Davies. Marion Davies was a woman who knew exactly how to make a man open his wallet for her whims. As the longtime mistress and greatest passion of media tycoon William Randolph Hearst, she did not merely live in luxury, she practically drowned in it. In 1926, Hearst, whose fortune seemed inexhaustible, decided to present his favorite with a modest seaside retreat in Santa Monica. In reality, this so-called beach house was a colossal mansion that cost a staggering $1 million to build, an almost unthinkable sum at the time. It was where the sweep of the Hollywood dream collided head-on with the boundless capital of a newspaper king. The house contained 34 bedrooms, each appointed with brazen extravagance. Hearst shipped antiques across the Atlantic by the boatload, carved gilded ceilings, marble floors salvaged from Italian palazzi, fireplaces that had once warmed kings. Marion, batting her lashes for reporters, insisted she was just an ordinary girl who loves the sound of the surf, though her daily life was attended by an army of servants, and her dining hall could seat 100 guests at once, feasting on lobster and washing it down with rare vintage champagne. At the heart of this seaside palace lay its crown jewel, a swimming pool, the largest private pool in Southern California, lined in white marble. An elegant Venetian-style bridge arched above it, and Marion delighted in parading across it in her finest gowns, while guests below drifted in the cool water. Her parties lasted for days. The cream of society passed through her doors. Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, even a young and ambitious John F. Kennedy. It was an endless carnival of vanity, and Hearst took care that his muse shone brighter than anyone else. He brought the most powerful people on the planet into that house to display his authority through the glitter of Davies's diamonds. Yet behind the gilded facades lay a sadder truth. Marion was a captive inside this golden aquarium. Hearst, obsessed with control, forbade her from drinking strong liquor, though she cleverly hid bottles of gin in toilet tanks, and monitored her movements through trusted intermediaries. The beach house was not simply a gift, it was a luxurious showcase in which Hearst exhibited his most prized possession. The sunset of this gilded fairy tale was swift and merciless. As Hearst's empire began to crack under the blows of the Great Depression and mounting political scandals, maintaining such a leviathan became an unbearable burden. The vast oceanfront mansion started to succumb to moisture and salt air. Gilding dulled, marble stained, tapestries absorbed the damp scent of neglect. After Hearst's death in 1951, Marion, by then weary of the ghosts of her past, moved quickly to part with the estate. She understood that without limitless funding, her beach house would soon crumble. The property changed hands several times. It served as a hotel and later as a private club, but eventually much of this architectural excess was demolished. Today, only a guest house and that famous pool remain, now incorporated into a public beach club. Where studio deals and newspaper headlines were once decided beneath the chime of crystal glasses, now children run along the deck and tourists lounge in the sun. Marion Davies' story is a vivid reminder of how quickly Hollywood's polish evaporates once the patron's money runs dry. She tried to build her life on a foundation of someone else's millions, believing marble and gold could secure happiness. In the end, her mansion became not a monument to love, but to excess that failed the test of time. Marion endures in memory as the queen of parties in a house that no longer exists, leaving behind only legends of golden ceilings and the echo of her laughter, once loud enough to drown out the roar of the ocean. Her beach house fell victim to history, proving that even the strongest walls cannot preserve fading grandeur when it was built on sand and borrowed ambition.
Humphrey Bogart went down in history as the Hollywood's ultimate tough guy, the man with a permanent cigarette between his lips and a weary gaze that suggested he had seen it all. On screen, he embodied stoic composure, but within the walls of his Los Angeles home, he was the epicenter of a natural disaster. His marriage to his third wife, actress Mayo Method, was so violently destructive that their estate in the Hollywood Hills earned an official nickname from neighbors and reporters alike, Sluggy Hollow. It was no joke, no clever metaphor. Bogart himself carried the name into interviews like a badge of honor, as if boasting about battle scars. While other stars of the era strained to project an image of white picket fences and blooming rose bushes, Bogart and Method might as well have hung a sign at the gate, "Proceed with caution. Two people who despise each other live here." Their house was not a sanctuary, but a boxing ring. Plates flew more often than dinner was served. The walls absorbed screams and the shattering of glass with such regularity that household staff rotated almost weekly, unable to endure the emotional crossfire. Inside Sluggy Hollow, the atmosphere could hardly be called domestic. Method, armed with a volcanic temper and a heavy hand, did not limit her means of expression. Ashtrays, whiskey bottles, even kitchen knives became instruments of emphasis. One of the most notorious episodes ended with Mayo stabbing Bogart in the back during yet another explosive argument. True to his screen persona, Humphrey did not call the police. He cleaned the wound, poured himself a drink, and carried on. He dragged drinking buddies and colleagues into this house, warning them that a visit might end in a brawl. Many guests chose to linger at the doorstep, sensing a storm gathering in the living room. The mansion became a monument to toxicity, every piece of furniture bearing the memory of some fracture or repair. Method and Bogart turned their domestic life into a never-ending noir thriller, where love was inseparable from violence, and the house itself served merely as a set for their mutual destruction. The surrounding hills trembled at their drunken spectacles. In public, Bogart was the impeccable gentleman in a trench coat. At home, he could become a sardonic provocateur who seemed to relish pushing his wife past the breaking point. A quarrel might begin in a restaurant, escalate in the car, and reach its crashing finale in the bedroom, leaving a trail of splintered wood and broken glass. For Hollywood at the time, such open chaos was unthinkable. Airing one's dirty laundry with that kind of brazenness bordered on rebellion. Yet Bogart appeared amused by it all. To him, an honest fistfight was preferable to a hypocritical smile. There was no trace of cowboy zen or pastel fantasy in that house. It smelled of tobacco, cheap liquor, and stale fury. Its walls did not witness the hero of Casablanca. They saw a weary man who had found a worthy adversary in his own wife. The ending was inevitable. When a young Lauren Bacall entered Bogart's life, Sluggy Hollow finally collapsed in spirit. Mayo Method moved out, leaving behind shattered mirrors and splintered doors. For years afterward, the house was whispered about as a place with bad energy. It stood as a perfect example of how a celebrity's private hell can seep into brick and mortar. Today, the mansion is no longer synonymous with bloodied fights, but the legend of Sluggy Hollow survives, a reminder that even Hollywood's toughest men paid for their success with fractured nerves and turned their homes into battlegrounds. Bogart proved that a star's mansion is not always a fortress. Sometimes it is a torture chamber, where instead of ghosts, very real demons of unchecked rage take up residence.
John Wayne. For all of America, John Wayne was more than an actor. He was the living embodiment of a national myth, a hard-faced man who settled problems with a Colt revolver and a heavy fist. Audiences were used to seeing him framed by dusty canyons, smelling of leather and gunpowder, and they were certain their hero must sleep at home on a narrow cot beneath a cowboy saddle. The reality behind the doors of his estate in the San Fernando Valley would have made any Western fan choke on his whiskey. On 5.5 acres, Wayne built a ranch that from the outside looked perfectly suited to the Duke. Massive wooden gates, stables, and sun-scorched grass stretching under the California sky. But the moment one crossed the threshold of his private residence, the image of the rugged macho man dissolved, replaced by something unexpected, almost surreal, a kind of cowboy zen. Instead of buffalo horns, bear skins, and a proud display of Winchesters, the interiors were filled to the brim with refined Asian art that Wayne had collected for decades, hauling it back from film shoots around the world, from Japan to Hong Kong. In the living room of Hollywood's most masculine icon, there was no soot-blackened hearth with a cast-iron pot. Instead, delicate Chinese lacquer screens inlaid with mother-of-pearl shimmered against the walls, and ancient scrolls of calligraphy hung in quiet dignity, works in which John was said to find deep philosophical meaning. The contrast between his screen persona and his domestic life was so striking that friends often teased him, asking whether he had wandered onto the set of a film about Marco Polo by mistake. Wayne paid little attention to their jokes. He surrounded himself with fragile Ming porcelain vases and serene Buddha figurines that looked almost absurd beside his towering frame. He carried this passion for the East through all 3 of his marriages, expecting his wives to accept that their bedroom would resemble an imperial palace rather than a comfortable American home. It was said that John could spend hours in his study contemplating miniature Japanese rock gardens, while outside, tough men in spurred boots waited for him. This was his private form of escape. The man who embodied violence and frontier conquest on screen sought stillness and reflection at home. His mansion became a monument to his hidden nature. Behind the rough manners stood a collector with a discerning eye, capable of distinguishing an authentic masterpiece from a forgery by a single brushstroke on silk. John's circle took time to grow accustomed to his leader dining beneath the watchful gaze of jade dragons. Hollywood whispered that the Duke was in truth a closet intellectual who merely played the simple fellow for paychecks worth millions. His home became a place where cowboy aesthetics surrendered to Eastern wisdom. He brought colleagues there who felt awkward, terrified of smashing a priceless vase with their broad elbows. The irony was that John himself saw no contradiction. He believed a real man could ride hard across open land and still admire the delicate craftsmanship of an antique lacquer box. His estate in the San Fernando Valley was his private monastery, where instead of prayers there were stories from old film shoots, yet the scenery remained steadfastly Zen. It was a perfect example of how stars of the Golden Age built sanctuaries that stood in direct opposition to their public masks. Today, John Wayne's house no longer exists in its original form, and his legendary collection was dispersed at auction after his death. It turned out that cowboy zen was too personal a passion to survive its owner. Fans are left with the westerns in which Wayne remains stern and straightforward, while tales of his love for silk screens and Buddha statues sound like a graceful legend. And yet that ranch in the San Fernando Valley remains etched in Hollywood lore as one of the strangest interior experiments of its time. Proof that even beneath the widest cowboy hat there can dwell thoughts of eternal peace and distant beauty. Wayne showed that his true home was not the prairie, but a quiet corner where he could simply be himself without ever needing to draw his revolver from its holster.
Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow was the first woman in Hollywood history to be officially crowned a bombshell, her blinding platinum hair as unmistakable a brand as the roaring lion of MGM. Yet behind the image of the carefree temptress stood an exhausted young woman desperate to find some island of safety in the vast ocean of Hollywood illusion. In 1932, at the height of her fame, Harlow moved into an elegant white mansion on Palm Avenue in Beverly Hills. Unlike the gaudy castles of her peers, this house was restrained, neoclassical, almost austere, the perfect frame for her cool, otherworldly radiance. Jayne arrived with a small army of decorators, insisting that everything inside be immaculate white. Deep pile carpets, satin drapes, even the grand piano in the living room. She was building a shrine to herself, the platinum goddess, convinced that in such sterile purity she could hide from the scandals that trailed her family and her failed marriages. The walls bore witness to her attempts at normalcy. She planted white roses in the garden with her own hands and carefully selected bright accents for the furniture, small flashes of color meant to soften the icy aesthetic. But the white of that house soon ceased to symbolize innocence. It began to resemble a shroud. Harlow lived under the suffocating control of her domineering mother and her opportunistic stepfather, who siphoned money from her as relentlessly as the studio lights drained her strength. The Palm Avenue mansion became a gilded cage. It was within those white rooms that one of Hollywood's darkest dramas unfolded, the death of her husband, Paul Byrne, found lifeless in their bedroom barely 2 months after their wedding. Afterward, people said Jayne would sit for hours in silence, staring at the flawless white walls as if they had absorbed the horror into their plaster. Her home turned into a place where the brilliance of spotlights gave way to the heavy shadows of depression. She tried to fill the emptiness with endless parties, yet even surrounded by guests, she seemed like a ghost wandering through her own palace. The pristine interior that was meant to soothe her began to press in on her, transforming into a stage set for the slow fading of a star not yet 30. The tragedy reached its climax in 1937 during the filming of Saratoga. Harlow suddenly collapsed. She was brought back to her white mansion, where she began to die slowly of kidney failure. The scene was almost surreal, the most desired woman in the world, pale as her own bedsheets, dimming amid the luxury she had so meticulously assembled. Reporters from across Los Angeles kept vigil at the gates, while inside, the final act of a brief but incandescent life unfolded. She died at just 26. Almost immediately, the house on Palm Avenue gathered legends around it. Subsequent owners and curious visitors claimed that the scent of her beloved Mitsuko perfume still lingered in the white corridors, and that at night one could hear the distinctive husky laugh of the platinum blonde. The mansion became a monument to the brevity of Hollywood fame, a comfortable tomb erected at the summit of success, which ultimately received its mistress forever and left the world with nothing but flickering images on film. Today, the facade remains largely unchanged. Tourists still pause at its gates, hoping to glimpse Jayne Harlow's shadow in an upstairs window. Inside, of course, the interiors have long since been modernized, and the white glamour has yielded to contemporary taste. Yet the spirit of MGM's bombshell seems sealed into the foundation itself. It is a perfect example of how a star may try to build a refuge from the world, only to construct instead the backdrop for her own finale. Harlow carried the burden of being a sex symbol to her final breath, and her white house on Palm Avenue endures in memory as the most elegant and the saddest mansion of classical Hollywood. A place where the brightness of the walls was merely a screen upon which tragedy played out beyond the reach of any makeup or spotlight.
Fred Astaire. To the world, Fred Astaire was the very definition of perfection, a man in white tie and tails who seemed to tap dance even to the corner bakery and never allowed a single crease to mar his trousers. His screen image was steeped in old-school conservative elegance, and admirers were certain that at home he lived among dark wood paneling, leather armchairs, and the faint aroma of expensive tobacco, something akin to a refined English club. But in 1954, when his beloved wife Phyllis passed away, Fred suddenly realized that the walls of his old mansion pressed in on him with the weight of memory.
Determined to begin again, he built a new house in Beverly Hills in 1959, a house that delivered a sharp slap to public taste and to his own carefully polished image. It was the bachelor's den of a man who had abruptly decided that tradition was dull and elegance could be a cage. Astaire carried the reputation of a gentleman everywhere he went, yet inside his new home he staged a quiet rebellion against all that was expected of him. Gone were the crystal chandeliers and antique dressers. In their place stood modern furniture better suited to a fashionable beatnik or an avant-garde painter. Well into his 60s, Fred developed a sudden affection for wild, almost psychedelic patterns and bold prints that made his conservative actor friends recoil the moment they stepped into his living room. The heart of this peculiar sanctuary was a space Astaire called his relaxation zone. The sofas were upholstered in such outrageous designs that even his famous striped ties seemed subdued by comparison. He filled the walls with contemporary art, sometimes daring, sometimes questionable, abstract canvases in which nothing could be discerned except an explosion of color. It was as though he were shaking off the dust of decades spent in impeccable suits. The house became his manifesto of late liberation. Friends later admitted it was surreal to see this lean, impeccably groomed man standing amid interiors that looked like an explosion in a textile factory. But Astaire could not have cared less. He reveled in a reality where he no longer had to satisfy the expectations of an audience. The house stood as a monument to a man who decided he had the right to be eccentric within the four walls he had paid for himself. In his den, he spent hours doing what he loved most, rehearsing steps, now against backdrops of surreal wallpaper that seemed almost to dance along with him. There were no shrines to past glory in this home. Astaire did not hang his awards or display posters from his old films. He lived in the present tense. He invited young musicians and artists into the space, absorbing their energy, trying to understand the new currents sweeping through the culture of the 60s. Guests remembered him discussing modern painting for hours while seated in a fuchsia armchair, a scene that felt lifted from an experimental film. His bachelor refuge was the place where Fred could finally stop being that Astaire and simply be Fred, a man with an eccentric taste in upholstery and a deep affection for quiet. The mansion became his armor against aging. By surrounding himself with vivid colors and daring forms, he defied time, preserving flexibility not only in his legs, but in his mind. It was perhaps the only house in Beverly Hills where classicism was declared outlawed and the right to make bold design mistakes elevated to a virtue. Today, almost nothing remains of that bachelor's den. Later owners, startled by the great dancer's audacious taste, hastened to restore the mansion to respectability, repainting the walls beige and discarding the outrageous sofas to the landfill of history. Astaire left behind the image of the perfect partner to Ginger Rogers, but his true home would have told a different story. The story of a solitary man who at life's twilight decided it was too short to be spent on dull couches. Fred proved that true elegance lies in the courage to be oneself, even if that means living amid prints so wild they make the eyes blur. His mansion was his final great dance, solo, peculiar, and entirely free of other people's expectations.
Sophia Loren. While the Hollywood divas of the classical era competed to see who could erect the grandest mansion in the hills of Beverly Hills, Sophia Loren merely smiled with quiet condescension. She belonged to a different scale altogether, an European icon who had no intention of propping up her legend with studio plywood and papier-mâché fantasies. For their family nest, Sophia and her husband, producer Carlo Ponti, chose not simply a house, but a historical artifact, Villa Sera, a majestic 16th-century estate nestled in the picturesque hills of Marino, just outside Rome. While her American counterparts raised cardboard castles, Loren invested in permanence, transforming the ancient villa into a monument to Mediterranean grandeur.
This was more than a residence, it was a declaration of Italian triumph. The girl who had grown up in the poverty of post-war Pozzuoli now owned walls that had witnessed centuries turn and still held the cool breath of history. She filled the villa with Italy's finest art, creating interiors where every piece of furniture carried a lineage and every ceiling bore the hand of long-forgotten masters whose names had faded but whose talent endured. The scale of Villa Sera astonished even those accustomed to California excess. More than 50 rooms stretched across an estate framed by olive groves, vineyards, and gardens, where Mediterranean sunlight shimmered on the marble of antique statues. Sophia personally oversaw the restoration, ensuring that modern comforts would not suffocate the soul of the place. In 1964, she opened her doors to Life magazine for one of the most iconic photo sessions in cinematic history. The world saw her in her principal bedroom, a chamber closer to a throne room, with a vast canopied bed, heavy velvet drapes, and silk-lined walls. She posed with such effortless authority that it seemed she had been born into those surroundings, sealing her status as a queen of the world screen. Through those halls passed presidents, royalty, and great artists, each sensing they had entered a realm where time stood still and luxury was stripped of Hollywood vulgarity. It was the triumph of European authenticity over American imitation. Yet Villa Sera was not merely a symbol of success, it was a fortress guarding the family's private life from relentless scrutiny. Within its thick stone walls, Sophia was not a diva, but a wife and mother, free to be herself. She crafted her own version of serenity, Italian in spirit, endless terraces overlooking the Roman hills instead of manicured Zen gardens. Guests whispered that Loren would descend to the kitchen herself to prepare pasta, brushing aside the grandeur and gold service as if they were incidental. But even this idyll did not escape reality. For decades, Italian authorities dragged the couple through courtrooms, accusing them of tax evasion and illegal capital transfers. The estate endured searches and legal sieges, its storied rooms witnessing not only glittering diamonds, but also the tears of a woman who risked losing her sanctuary to bureaucratic warfare. Sophia fought for that house with the same fierce passion she brought to her finest roles, knowing that this villa was her truest life award. Today, Villa Sera remains a legend, a golden age of Italian cinema and the indomitable will of a woman who created herself. Sophia Loren proved that a true star needs no pink fur or painted facades to assert her importance. History, stone, and sunlight are enough. Her so-called strange mansion turned out to be the most rational and enduring of them all, surviving the fleeting obsessions and cheap spectacle that defined so many of her contemporaries. The story of Loren and her Roman villa is the final note in this chronicle, a reminder that amid Hollywood illusions and eccentricities, only what is rooted deeply and built with a genuine soul endures. Sophia remains the sovereign of her own destiny, and her home stands as a silent witness to how a poor girl from the outskirts of Naples built an empire sturdier than any Hollywood myth.
These 10 mansions are not merely piles of brick and antique clutter. They are diagnoses of people the world once held up as models of success and taste. Behind dazzling smiles and million-dollar contracts stood individuals who were deeply unhappy, pathologically frugal, or simply unhinged. People who tried to fill an inner void with pink fur, cardboard walls, or antiques quietly borrowed from film sets. We saw how fear of fans turned Valentino's life into a fortress haunted by bats, how Chaplin's obsessive thrift nearly buried him beneath collapsing stagecraft, and how the ghosts of the past quite literally drove new owners from the legendary Pickford. These walls witnessed everything,
from bloody brawls in Bogart's so-called ravine of scandals to Jean Harlow's solitary tears in her sterile white paradise. For decades, Hollywood's dream factory led us by the nose, selling the image of a perfect life while its brightest stars padded their walls to muffle the cries of their own conscience or hid behind Chinese screens to escape the lingering scent of gunpowder from their roles. Now that you've stepped through those hidden doors and seen the rot that sometimes festered beneath fresh paint and gilding, you understand that the real Hollywood is not found on red carpets. It lives in these strange, unsettling, profoundly lonely castles, places most of their owners never managed to call home. The truth has proved far dirtier and stranger than any screenplay. This ending is simply a reminder that even the brightest stars eventually fade, surrounded by absurd clutter and the echo of phantom laughter, leaving behind nothing but dust on the ruins of their ambitions. If this investigation made you shudder at the design choices of idols past, like the video. Subscribe to the channel to be the first to learn what secrets lie hidden in the safes and bedrooms of the great. And tell us in the comments which of these houses you wouldn't last a single night in. We read every opinion and are ready to keep tearing the masks from the most carefully guarded secrets of classic Hollywood.